Great books about the entertainment industry are fascinating reads. They always give incredible insight into the inner workings of the business and also the personalities behind the headlines. The classics are books like Disney War, Desperate Networks or Hit and Run. The last of these detailed the takeover of Columbia Pictures by Sony in the 1990s, and Ben Fritz's best-selling book, The Big Picture, covered a more recent chapter in that studio's history, the hack by North Korea. But it was also about the way that franchise building had taken over the creative process in Hollywood, and the impact of the new streaming distribution model on the way the movie business was configured. So I was delighted to have the Wall Street journalist and author join me on the pod to dissect all of this further. Enjoy. Hi Ben, welcome to the pod.
Hi, thank you.
So to get things started with a fun question, my question to you is this. If Ben Fritz was a character in a movie, would it be a tense political thriller, like something like All the President's Men, or perhaps a Marvel blockbuster?
I'd like to think that I would be the Marvel blockbuster type. It's a lot of fun, and then my son would like watching me. But for better or for worse, one of my skills as a journalist is that I really like to, hone in on every. I'm very nitpicky. I notice things in the logic that are wrong, and a Marvel movie is not the place to have somebody hanging out who's like, well, that doesn't technically make sense because an hour ago you said this, and how does time travel really work? And that's no fun, right? I definitely be the All the President's Men guy. I think just for the sake of not torturing the audience.
Okay, very good. Well, I think your career embraces both of these sides. But
yes, I've one of the rare person who's applying the All the President's Men level scrutiny to the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
But in the big picture, you mentioned that you didn't always feel naturally suited to be a journalist. Growing up, was journalism and writing of interest? When did you first decide that you wanted to be a reporter?
I always loved consuming journalism. I read a lot of newspapers and magazines, but I wasn't a particularly great writer. That didn't seem like my skill. And I think I thought that was maybe, I thought, if you're a journalist, you write, you really got to be a great writer. And I also didn't think I had that sort of personality where, like, I was a pretty introverted person. I didn't think I had the personality where I'm like, oh, I'll be great at interviewing people and getting them to open up to me, which I, would see in the movies, like All the President's Men. That's what journalists had to do. So I knew I loved journalism, but I didn't think I was necessarily suited to produce it. And I had two experiences that changed my mind. One was that I took a class at the University of Pennsylvania. I went to a college in the suburbs of Philly, but I was able to take a class at UPenn taught by a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter. And I learned two things from him that were so valuable. One was that being a journalist is first and foremost about the reporting. It's about noticing things. It's not necessarily about being a great writer. And I am very good at noticing things. And I am very good at taking different facts and putting them together. And that excited me. And also that the sort of social skills I've had to interview people are things that I really could learn. It's not like, oh, you have to naturally be an extrovert. It's something you can learn. People want to talk to a journalist, or they have to, depending on their position. And then you can learn the interview skills. And I learned this is something I was better suited for than I thought, and I could learn the rest, and I could learn the writing as well. And then also around the same time, right after graduating, I wanted to learn more about Hollywood because I was super interested in the entertainment industry. And by luck, the former editor-in-chief of Variety went to the same college I did. And I contacted him looking for advice, and he suggested maybe I could intern at Variety. And I did. And I loved it there. And it seemed like, oh, this might be exactly the kind of career I'd want to pursue.
So in the end, I guess that Variety internship was very helpful because in 2004, you made the move to Variety. And I suppose that passion and having that existing relationship probably helped. How competitive is it, or was it, in getting stories for Variety, going up against all these other publications, whether it's Hollywood Reporter or the LA Times, and then later Deadline? And it must be tough getting...
Yes. It's definitely competitive, and that's where, when I was talking about earlier about being a journalist is more about the reporting and the writing, that really, I learned that at Variety, and it was great for me because the articles in Variety are very straightforward. So-and-so is negotiating with so-and-so to buy this movie, so-and-so was cast, this was the box office, et cetera, right? It's the important thing is, can you get the information first before your competitors? And it's very competitive. Back then it was mainly about Variety and the Hollywood Reporter. I would be assigned to cover a studio or to cover the box office, and it was all about developing relationships with studio executives, producers, agents, managers. And that's something that I really had to learn. And every day, it was like, okay, what's the latest scoop that you can bring? That's how you were valued as a reporter. That's what made Variety a must read, is whether or not we had scoops that the other trade did not.
And so to what extent is your ability to do that job based on the publication that you're at? And to what extent does it come down to those skills of developing those relationships personally?
I look at it as, the publication you're at give you this advantage. It helps you get in the door, right? People may like, I really should talk to the reporter from Variety because, I work at Warner Brothers, let's say, and we need to have a relationship with Variety. But if you don't develop a good relationship with that source, then they're not going to tell you anything more than they feel they need to, than they're required to. And they're going to, if they've developed a relationship with another reporter somewhere else, they're going to more enjoy talking to them. So yes, it's easier to get that first meeting, get somebody to get the introduction if you work at Variety than if you work at, say, a new website nobody's heard of, for sure. And at the time, Variety was a little bigger than the Reporter. So even there, I had a small advantage. But I learned quickly that having a relationship that was a little independent, that was where they really respected and had a relationship with me, was most valuable. And that's how I was able to get good stories eventually. And those relationships have served me in my career for more than 15 years. And I'll say the thing I really learned is it's not just about kissing ass and making them like you and just doing whatever they want. I would say the key to my relationships as a reporter is earning the trust and the respect of my sources. And respect means I don't always write what they wish I would, but when I write something that's critical of them or points out a flaw, that I'm accurate and that I really understand their business. I've often heard sources say to me, a lot of reporters who cover Hollywood don't actually understand the entertainment industry. They don't really understand the economics of how the business works. And you do, Ben. And that's gotten me really far, is that I take the time to actually understand what they do and how their business works. And that, to the best of my ability, I'm always fair.
You moved to the LA Times next. And I think of the LA Times as being one of those sort of national newspapers. I mean, I know America doesn't have national newspapers really, other than USA Today, like we do. They're much more city based, but still it's in that realm of very big city newspaper covering so much that's going on. And so where does entertainment fit in comparison with those two other publications?
Sure. Well, the LA Times was sort of an interesting middle ground for me between the other two papers I worked at, where, Variety is exclusively for people who work in the entertainment industry. And there's really sort of no story too small, anything that people might not have known is, just somebody switching jobs or a casting is of interest to Variety, right? The LA Times is just, the bar is higher, but we're writing for a hybrid audience. It's a real challenge. The majority of LA Times readers are general people who, most of them in Southern California, some of them other places in the US, but there's definitely a portion who work in the entertainment industry. And we wanted the LA Times to be a must read for them. This is our hometown industry, of course. We're their hometown paper. We can't cover every small thing the way Variety would, but we had to try to write really authoritatively and write stories where people in the industry would be like, yeah, the LA Times knows what it's talking about. And they covered it at Hollywood better than the New York Times can, or USA Today, or the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal, because they're the paper based here. So I felt like I was required to know everything going on, but then I had to be a little more selective about what stories I would write, because they had to also be of interest to this broader audience.
And then one step further removed, I guess, and you mentioned it, Wall Street Journal. So
Yes.
You then moved to the Wall Street Journal, and that's even more about, the bigger picture, to pardon the pun. So again, did that shift your brief and the way that you were looking at the industry?
Yes, because now we're running for an audience that's 99% not involved in entertainment and media. Hollywood is not our hometown industry per se. We had a smaller team covering Hollywood. I was one of, depending on the time, 2 or 3 people covering entertainment from LA, and maybe 4 or 5 total. A couple of others were New York. So it's smaller than the LA Times team. And we're we're writing for a huge audience, mostly in the US, but global to some extent. But definitely, the Wall Street Journal is, we like to say, it's looks at the world through a business lens. We're not exclusively a business and finance paper anymore, but we're certainly, a lot of our readers are in the world of business and finance and very interested in that topic. So now I thought my job is covering Hollywood with as much rigor as my colleagues might be covering Goldman Sachs or General Electric or the Federal Reserve or Apple. So I was trying to bring that kind of rigor to Hollywood and take it just as seriously as any other industry. So I feel like my business reporting chops had to get even higher. The journal has extremely high standards. And I really had to make sure that I was landing the biggest scoops, the most important ones, and that I had access to the highest level sources, that I was on top of the most important trends, and that our coverage of Hollywood was just as good as it was of any other industry. And the journal covers Wall Street and Silicon Valley better than any paper on the planet, in my opinion. So that's a very high standard to reach.
And so on that basis, and around about that time, so we're talking now, you moved to the Wall Street Journal, I think in 2013.
Yes.
And then 2014 comes the Sony Pictures hack, which I guess was an important and interesting story as a kind of a general piece of news about what was happening in the US economy and about international relations. What then led to the book that ultimately became The Big Picture?
Sure. So I covered the hack, of course, in late 2014. It was probably the biggest story of my career to date. To have a major US corporation hacked by North Korea and so much sensitive business information exposed. I mean, it was a massive business story. It was a tech story. It was an international relations story. I was regularly getting stories on the front page of the paper, which doesn't happen that often at a huge paper like the Wall Street Journal. And I'm working with colleagues who cover foreign relations and hacking, which I hadn't done. So it was just a huge, compelling, exciting story for me for about a month and a half. And then as it was sort of dying down in the winter of 2015, I was contacted by a book agent. What he thought at first is he thought that maybe there was a book in the hack sort of along the lines of, if you remember the book Too Big to Fail, which about, the economic collapse in 2008, 2009. And that went behind the scenes of the people at the Wall Street banks and the Federal Reserve saving the US economy, basically. And he thought there'd be a book going inside Sony, like what happened around the hack. That was his suggestion, because he had represented the author of Too Big to Fail. And we talked about it for a while, but my sort of conclusion soon enough was, there wasn't enough drama just of what happened behind the scenes in the hack. There was not a book just about how Sony responded to it. And so much of it was covered, I think, well by myself and other journalists at the time. There wasn't a lot left. But then in the process of thinking about that, I read a lot more material from the hack. And there was so much. I still hadn't read 90% of it. And I read some more. And at some point, you just have this moment where some pieces come together and the light bulb really goes off. And I had that moment where I was like, I've been thinking for years that the biggest trend in Hollywood, in the movie business that I've been covering, is how franchises have taken over the business, how original movies for adults, there's fewer and fewer of them every year. They're really hard to get made. And it seems like Marvel and Fast and Furious and Harry Potter have completely taken over Hollywood. And people all the time would ask me, why is that? And all these emails on the Sony hack were the answer. You could see the executives at Sony debating this very point and struggling to compete with Marvel and Harry Potter and so on, and struggling to see if they could still justify making original dramas or thrillers for adults. And I was like, the story is here. I could use this material to tell that story. And that came together, and I wrote a book proposal out of that, and I was able to sell it pretty quickly.
How did you picture Sony at that point as you started to delve into the intricacies of the studio?
I definitely knew Sony was a studio that was kind of struggling to keep up with Disney. They basically only had Spider-Man was their only major franchise. And the last two Spider-Man movies, The Amazing Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield, had not done as well as they had hoped. Certainly were not matching the box office numbers of the Marvel produced movies. And Amy Pascal, who ran Sony's movie business, had a reputation for being better at mid-budget movies, comedies, dramas, thrillers, and not at the big budget franchises. She was not a Kevin Feige type. So I knew that about them. And I also knew that their Japanese parent company, which at that point had owned them for 20 years, had never really figured out what to do with them and why they belonged in the parent conglomerate. So that was my sense of them, and it was generally correct. It wasn't like in the hack I found out something radically different that I didn't know, but there was just a lot of detail that I didn't understand and appreciate about how they were doing their jobs and what specific challenges they faced.
The book points to a very specific date, November the 21st, 2013, as a watershed moment when Amy and her team realized that profit really came before creativity at Sony. But then I guess the studios in general, and that's really the main thrust of the book, is that it's all about the profit.
Right. And specifically that creativity does not lead to profit. It used to be if you were the most creative studio, you were the most profitable studio. That was the business model. The business model was you get someone like Amy Pascal, who works with the best creative talent to make the most interesting slate of films, and the profits will follow. And that used to work back when TV wasn't doing the kind of stuff film was. TV was all advertiser supported and sitcoms and cop shows. And back when DVD sales were really robust. And once that changed, the movie business became much more franchise driven. And the business model had to be focused on franchises. It couldn't just be work with the best talent and come up with the most creative ideas. And because of that, someone like Amy had to explain herself to Wall Street. I mean, that's what you're talking about. In November of 2014, Sony Pictures, which had a lousy year, or several lousy years, in fact, had this, to the extent that an activist shareholder was going after them. So they had this investors day on the lot where they brought in all these, big Wall Street folks, and Amy had to kind of kiss their asses and show them how she was focused more on profitability than she used to be. And one thing I certainly didn't know at the time, but found out from the hack, was that it was a humiliating experience for her, and she hated it. And as soon as it was done, behind the scenes, she was emailing her, friends in the industry, basically saying, "Don't pay any attention to what I said. That was just a dog and pony show for Wall Street."
One of the other interesting things that you pick up on, and you mentioned Spider-Man earlier, was that initially Sony got the rights to Spider-Man. Peter Schlessel had gone out and got the rights initially for Sony back in the early 90s. And then Yair Landau, another Sony exec, brought a proposal to the studio in 1998 to buy the whole of Marvel for $25 million. Now, if that deal had come off, would that actually have changed the course of Hollywood history? I'm not just Sony history, but actually by leveling the studio playing field a bit, or quite considerably, it possibly would have made it harder for Disney to go out and build that critical mass of IP to launch Disney Plus, and Disney's move into direct to streaming and direct to consumer has really sparked so many of the other studios to do the same. So it's like a chain reaction almost from that moment.
Yes, it was a really pivotal moment in history that most people didn't know about. It was amazing when I found this out in the process of researching the book. So to be clear, Sony they weren't going to buy Marvel entirely, but they had an offer for $25 million to get the movie rights to most of Marvel's characters. Everybody who became the MCU, essentially, Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, Black Widow, Black Panther, and on and on. Sony could have gotten them all for $25 million. And, the studio brass turned it down. They only wanted Spider-Man. They thought all the other characters were worthless. Yeah, if you think about, if they had just taken that deal, I think there's two possibilities. One is they would have made the movies successfully, and Sony would have been probably the most successful studio of the 21st century, and they would have been the home of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it would have looked, in hindsight, like the best deal any studio had ever done, and that Marvel had made the worst deal possible. The other possibility is that Sony would have screwed it up. They would have tried to make these movies and done it poorly, and they would have kind of ruined the Marvel brand. I don't know does Amy Pascal's team know how to make an Avengers movie as well as Kevin Feige did? Maybe not. If they didn't, then Marvel wouldn't be so beloved, I don't think. And then you wouldn't have the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You wouldn't have superheroes dominating Hollywood. And certainly, to your point, Disney would not have bought Marvel. There wouldn't have been value there. Either way, either Sony had the movies successfully, so why buy Marvel, or Sony had screwed it up, so it seems like it's not a good deal. And then if Marvel doesn't buy Disney, Disney doesn't buy Marvel, Disney's not nearly as successful a company. Disney doesn't have as good an IP to launch Disney Plus. I mean, the repercussions would have been massive.
So it was a tough period for Sony for a number of reasons, but looking back over the last 12 months in particular, they've had a really stellar time at the box office, really, really successful at a time when a lot of studios have kind of almost not shunned the box office, but have seen it as a less important factor. And And then Viacom and Paramount have now sort of gone through quite a lot of changes, and the Paramount brand is now front and center in the old Viacom space.
Mm-hmm.
So that, in a way, is almost about the renaissance of traditional studios and their ability to be independent and to have movies at the forefront of what they do. But equally, Warner Media has just merged with Discovery, and Amazon has just bought, again, one of the most storied movie brands in MGM. So are we going to see less chance of consolidation within Hollywood, or are we going to just continue to see the mergers and acquisition process go forwards because of this need for scale and franchise and brand?
Oh yeah, I tend to think we'll continue to see consolidation. I mean, there's clearly sort of too many streaming services, direct to consumer services out there right now, and it would, if you want to be able to compete with Disney Plus and Netflix, even despite Netflix's recent problems, you need bigger scale than something like Paramount Plus or a Peacock has. Yeah, Sony's doing better. Sony's doing well at the box office right now, for sure. They're having a good year, and their movie business, I'm sure, is quite profitable. But are they building value, the way that like a Disney builds value by creating, Disney Plus? I mean, certainly not. I mean, that's still where like the big enterprise value for a company is right now. And basically, so Sony's success is a few big hit movies, and partly helped by the fact that they don't have a streaming service, right? So their movies are exclusive to theaters for a long time. So they've had Venom and the last Spider-Man No Way Home and Uncharted all do quite well at the box office and be profitable films. So Sony still isn't building value as a company the way that Disney is or is trying to. Warner Discovery will be trying to. And I think you're going to see consolidation. And I think you're still inevitably going to see the box office. The theatrical window is only home for the sort of biggest event franchise films for the most part. And direct-to-consumer streaming is still, is going to be the most important business in entertainment, regardless of whether or not it's the most profitable. It's like, this is what consumers are demanding, and it's what consumers want. And I don't think there's any going back. Hollywood used to have a lot more power to be like, you'll see this when we want you to see it on the platform that we choose. And Netflix, for better or worse, changed that paradigm. And I don't see how any company can be successful trying to go back to the old way of doing things.
It's interesting you talk about that and that desire to service the needs and demands of the viewing public. I noticed a tweet that you put out in reaction to the Netflix results, because the studios used to complain about piracy, and the tech industries were really about, can we provide what the customer wants when they want it? And now Netflix are almost saying, yeah, but now that things have changed a little bit in terms of who we are, we don't like password sharing, for example. Yep. And so we're not sure we want to give the customer exactly what they want when they want it. So in a way, are streaming services like Netflix becoming more like studios in their own way?
Well, they're starting to see a little bit of the wisdom of the studios being like, you can go too far in giving consumers what they want. Like when Netflix didn't care about password sharing, then one person could subscribe and it was share their account with a bunch of their friends or family members. And that's being very consumer friendly. But at some point, that's going to damage the business, obviously. 3 households that might subscribe on their own, now you might only have 1 subscription. So that's really damaging your business. And Netflix, now that Netflix's growth is stalling or going into reverse, they're realizing that's a serious problem. Now, you can't have a business that's entirely consumer unfriendly. And Netflix is still, despite its problems, is a $100 billion business. It's built in large part on being way more consumer friendly than the studios and networks and cable companies used to be. But you can go too far. And if you give the consumers exactly what they want, then you'll never have a profit. People would love to have everything wherever they want to watch it at the time they want to watch it for the cheapest price possible. That's not necessarily compatible with a business that's making movies and TV shows that cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
Do you think in some ways Netflix gets quite a hard time because, as you say, it is a massive business that is generating 1.5, $1.6 billion of net revenue on a per quarter basis. And yet, as it hits some headwinds, which inevitably it was going to, and some of those headwinds are to do with losing 700,000 subscribers in Russia, for example. Do you think that they get a particularly hard time when something like their most recent results come along.
Absolutely. I mean, they're so heavily hyped, and they've, the market valuing them, let's say, so far ahead of their skis that any ding in their armor is a massive story, and they lose a lot of stock value all at once. They've been an amazing, amazing Cinderella story for so long that anything that goes wrong there is massive news. And their stock price was so precarious. It was based on so many assumptions about unending growth that any sign of anything going wrong is going to damage them significantly. So I get why it's big news. I think it should be big news. I mean, anytime a company loses 35% of their stock value in a day, tens of billions of dollars, it's a huge story. Absolutely. But to conclude that Netflix is some kind of a failure and we all believed the streaming myth would be ridiculous. Netflix has completely transformed the paradigm of entertainment, of the idea of how entertainment should be delivered. And they've still gone from this little startup that sent DVDs by mail 20 something years ago to $100 billion streaming behemoth that is a more successful entertainment brand than any of the traditional entertainment companies except maybe Disney. That is an amazing accomplishment. And even if Netflix never gets a single more subscriber, if they're stalled exactly where they are a major power player, and it's one of the biggest stories in entertainment of this century.
So in a way, are we kind of returning to a traditional shape of the business in the sense that it's an industry with a few big players, not necessarily the same as they were, because we have now these streaming services, but there's kind of major studios now in their own right who control distribution. And then we have an ad-funded world, and ad-funded feels like it may be getting a bit of a comeback. And particularly in the world of fast channels as a future distribution mechanism. And so it's really about advertising on one hand and big players in the subscription pay TV business just delivered in another way. And actually we've coming full circle in the not too distant future.
Yeah, some things are now kind of stabilizing back to the way they were, and some things I think are fundamentally different, right? So the business model has changed somewhat. Right now, subscription streaming is front and center for sure. But now you have a business where it used to be, there was sort of the cable bundle, there was advertising and broadcast, and there was theatrical. Let's say those were sort of the key parts that every major entertainment company had. All those. Now, most major entertainment companies have a subscription streaming service. They're all starting to have, if they don't have already, an ad-supported service, and many of them have a theatrical business as well, though the theatrical is much smaller than it used to be, and I don't see that coming back to the way it was. And the other thing that's similar is, and if you include Disney, Warner, NBC Universal, and I'd include Netflix, they all have the same distribution capabilities. It used to be, well, Netflix was really ahead of the game. Now they all have a good streaming service. They can all do it. And to a large extent, I think it depends on who has the better slate of content. The way it used to be, 20 years ago, turn of the century, was, well, which studio is producing the better TV shows and movies this year? And because it's not like anybody had a significant advantage in channels or in the ability to put movies in theaters. So that, in that sense, there's something similar. It's back to who can produce the best content. Here's one thing that was completely different: is you have this weird, let's say, wild cards of the tech giants, which are now Amazon and Apple. You have these two big companies that are spending billions of dollars in entertainment that are not primarily entertainment companies. And they are not playing by the same rules. They could, if they choose to, tomorrow spend an extra 10 or $20 billion a year. Just like Amazon spent $9 billion on MGM, nobody else would ever spend that much on MGM. They can completely shake things up if they want to. Or you can imagine tomorrow Tim Cook dies and his successor comes in and he's like, why are we in entertainment? Like Apple is the company of iPhones and Macs. Like, this is a waste of our money. Shut it down. And then a pretty big entertainment company is just gone overnight. So that is the weird wild card that is completely qualitatively different than we've ever seen before.
Well, there is that proverb that says, may you live in interesting times, which is seen actually as more of a curse than anything else. So I guess we are living in interesting times. And one of those left field moments that came along was the pandemic. And as a result, one of the questions that I ask my guests is the one that I'll pose to you, which is, if you found yourself in a lockdown, which hopefully now is more of a thing of the past, but what would be the film, the book, the music choice, and the box set that would get you through one of those?
Well, the movie would probably be Election, the Alexander Payne movie with Matthew Broderick. I just think that's one of the funniest movies. Such like a great astute observation of like American culture, American politics. I always find new things to laugh at in that movie and think about. So I could watch that over and over again. If I had to pick one favorite film, that would be it. My favorite book is Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I just find that to be like, he's such an, even in translation, he's one of the most beautiful writers, I think, on the planet. And that book is this profound insight into like what love is and what it means. And I've read it twice. Hopefully I'll read it a few more times before I die. So I take that to the island for sure. The album is a tough one. I'm not as big a music person, but I love the band Fountains of Wayne, to be honest. And they're also like very astute observers of American culture, I think, which I really love. So I'd probably take their collected works if I could. And by box set, you probably meant like a TV series.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to be stuck on an island, and you're going to have to rewatch it, I think it's got to be a comedy. I'm going to have to go for like the first 10 seasons or so of The Simpsons, because that is not just one of the funniest, most significant comedies, I think, in all of television, but that show came out at just the right time. I think when it came on, I was in middle school, and I really almost feel like it created my sense of humor, like it taught me what was funny. And so I both find it hilarious, and it's like very nostalgic for me. It reminds me of like being an adolescent and learning about more sophisticated humor. So that's what I take.
Very good. Well, Ben Fritz, thank you so much for being a guest on the pod. I love the book. It's about a place that I know pretty well, but I think it definitely sits alongside so many of the other books that have been published over the years about the entertainment industry. It's called The Big Picture. It's been around for a while, but I think everybody who's involved in entertainment should read it at least once, and maybe it'll end up on somebody else's lockdown media choice at some point in the future.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much for having me.